Hi. I really don't like this angle, by the way, but because of the light. So what I did was I used my phone. Ah. But anyways, all right, babies. Something happened yesterday, which was beautiful, but kind of like one of those moments, like why mind? Why? And I'm talking about my mind. And what happened was, as I was talking about, like I was continuing a certain like session, when you're talking about stuff, then more things kind of start like correlating with it. And it's a beautiful thing the mind does. And sometimes that's basically how anxiety kicks in, because you start worrying about something, another thing that you could worry about, and then it piles up. But also when you're exploring something and you kind of like approach it. And I don't know if it's just like some form of resistance from me or something else. As I was doing the video, I was actually I was doing it as I was thinking, and a couple of things popped in my mind, and I wanted to grasp them, and it was selfish of me because these things I've talked about, I've noticed, I've basically the flow over the past week, and my train of thought towards like the world and how I was looking at the world was more of like how to deal with people, how to engage with people, and all that kind of stuff, and the ego that you have and the representation that you have. It was kind of like a mix of a whole lot of things together, and it felt like it was simmering down because I was trying my best to calm down and not really kind of like I was allowing my emotions to express themselves in a weird way. But ultimately, I I took a 10-second pause in order to think, and I wanted to collect the thoughts in my head and write them down. I didn't succeed with that. But then when I pressed play again, it didn't click, and I ended up talking for like 10, 9, 15 minutes. I don't know, just like talking and explaining. And before I noticed that you guys were not there because I wasn't recording, something beautiful had happened, and my mind was literally kind of rearranging the way I see things following through the conversation, and that's the best way I could explain it. And the previous topic was how do you deal with people and how do you interact with people, knowing full well that they have their own mind that thinks a certain kind of way, but they themselves are trying to represent themselves in front of you. So there's like the person in front of you, there's the mind that's basically moving thoughts around and expressing and helping express. And then there's the person. So, like, because the same way I'm looking at myself, I'm also ultimately, I think Aristotle's get know thyself. Once you know thyself, like you basically are able to understand others. And I don't say know thyself. I say get to know thyself personally, because I really believe like knowing yourself is kind of like one of those like know who you are. But the reality is like no, you don't really get to know. You don't know. You get to know, you figure it out. And anytime you're sure, you'll always be surprised with something, because anytime you kind of make a statement, you kind of cap your ego at like this is what I want as a presentation. So the goal is always to ask questions and to be more open-minded to the things you might like and things you might not like. You can make decisions, you can make statements, you can make like kind of like limitations, limit yourself, but ultimately you always need to kind of explore and realign, right? Like there's no, sometimes you're like, I'm not that weird, and then okay, that's not it. And sometimes you kind of like come back to the same things and you go like, those are not the things that I want to live my life around, and you make a decision around them. And sometimes they're positive things that you're like, I don't want to be that guy or girl, whatever you are. The idea behind it is to like figure out more about yourself and kind of align better, and if anything, negotiate with how you want to express, because ultimately your environment plays a role, your mind, thoughts, and everything that you actually engage with plays a role with the human around you, with the people around you, and everything around you, the buildings, everything. And you also kind of like are yourself. So how do you engage with people differently, knowing full well that what you're talking to, like the face of everything, is not all that's there, right? And that's what people, a lot of people would be like, you don't know what people are going through, so you always have to keep in mind and develop some empathy and be thoughtful. And all these words, like we understand them, but we don't really like kind of create a space for them in our mental model of people and the world and engagements. And this mental model thing, I've like recently been a bit too big into it, specifically because I realized that ultimately everything you do is has to be designed in your head so beautifully. And I did a video about that. It's just like if the road between your home and work, the first couple of days to go to work, man, you're thinking of the road. Then eventually it becomes so automatic you don't think because you're going through that road more than once. And the same thing you want to do with everything around you. If you create a mental model, then you'll be able to explore anything you want, extract anything you want, build the connection that I talked about a couple of videos ago, the connection that you have towards understanding anything, a concept, a subject, an individual. Like there's a thing, you don't have to store it in your head, you don't have to think about it anymore. Once you develop that connection, then you're tapped into like some divine consciousness or whatever you want to call it. But you're tapped into the source of the information that you need for something to be explained. And then all you have to do is just be creative in how you let it out. And as I was thinking about that, I mentioned how like when you're looking at people from a different field, a level field, because ultimately when I'm looking at the camera right now, I am looking at the camera from this body. But ultimately, when I'm talking to people, if I'm talking to them directly, then that's the level of conversation that we're having because it's being extracted from this place directly. But if I give myself a chance to observe the conversation and in a way, kind of like, not necessarily be in my head while I'm having a conversation, but allow myself to observe how I'm talking and adjust based on the conversation. That's when people say listen, right? Because like when somebody is talking and you're listening, you're not listening to yourself think or the words in your head, and you're not you're not reacting to directly what the people are saying in your head or directly. What you're doing is you're basically taking that step back. And I think a step back is not really something that we should consider. I think really we're kind of like detaching ourselves in a dimensional way and like a third dimensional way, like in which is like our body is we're no longer in our body because we're kind of like in that zone where their words are expressing a lot more than just the words. They're expressing the sounds, the tonality, the body language, like everything about them kind of has to be observed. So you kind of have to step away from how you are in order to give them that time and space. That's the focus and attention that you have to give in order for you to understand completely what they're trying to say. And as I was discussing that, I started talking about the easier example for us to like consider is like, any memory you can have. And let's play this together. If you have a memory, and I have a memory of when I was 14 years old, I remember I was collecting Pokemon. Back then, that was the phase. And I was collecting Pokemon. I was literally like grabbing Pokemon and putting them in that like folder. I remember there were 150 Pokemon that you need to collect. And we used to like play games with them, like throw them on the floor and challenge each other. And if we flip them and if we do all kinds of stuff, we end up winning and all these kinds of things. So basically, and I was an asshole when it comes to school. I should apologize to that. I'm apologizing for how I was in school because I used to use my badge as a prefect in order for me to kind of like bully kids and finding the Pokemon that I need for my collection. So like I wasn't fuck me, man. I just remembered that. But the memory of me putting the Pokemon there and being an asshole to other kids was a memory where right now, I am looking at myself do that behavior, right? Because there's a clear distinction between me of now and me of then. Physically, mentally, emotionally, all these things. There's enough space between me and that person, that memory, where I am not looking at myself doing it. I'm observing when I'm looking at the memory of it and I'm remembering something. What I'm doing is I'm looking at myself do the thing that I'm remembering. So I'm observing myself from a third person's perspective. And as I was thinking about that, I kind of like my mind kind of started like building a different because I started, interestingly so, it's like these mini epiphanies that happen when more thoughts like throw themselves and kind of mold into like one big one, and a lot of different concepts kind of like start blending together into like one like field because you're building a stronger connection with yourself. Ultimately, you're explaining things to yourself, you're thinking properly, you're elaborating on things properly, and ultimately you're kind of like pushing towards something to be standardized that you can rely on. And diligence, principles, values, all of them play, and like you being an actual person that's consistent, all these things kind of play a role with how you trust yourself. And I was talking about that, and I was discussing literally this thought process where like you're kind of like talking to people, and how would you engage with people? You kind of have to like detach and look at them as if like they're a current memory in the happening. And the present moment, to actually be present, is literally you kind of like not being involved. That's where you're present. Because ultimately, you're not thinking of anything past or future. You're literally just taking a step back and watching it happen in front of you. And that space that you create, the same way when you remember something, that distance that you feel, if we can create that small space, that small distance between ourselves at the moment, we're able to observe ourselves change, evolve, and grow and interact. We're able to absorb ourselves in a more, I want to say, humble way, because it makes you see things that you could work with. That's who we are, right? Like we're growing up, we're evolving, we're developing, we're I don't know what other words do we need to use for this to actually reach. And when you're looking at something and you want to develop it, you kind of have to create that cute little dance between like take a step back, what are you doing, and then take a step forward. And I think when interacting with people, we forget that. And Eckhart Tolle says that, and I've been repeating it in many videos because, like he says, like you're present until you're around people. But I think that's the true nature that we build reveals itself around people. That's why we kind of lose that presence. But what if our nature is a nature of presence? What if our nature is a nature of just like observing and engaging, and then observing and engaging, like being objectively subjective, like using objective subjectivity and subjective objectivity as the tools for us to be able to like interact with the world, always being involved and always kind of like not being involved to a point where we can't alter the situation, and then our reality is literally under our own fingertips. Interesting stuff, I guess. Thank you, guys.